Most people think doctors get rich the moment they open their own clinic. The truth is almost the exact opposite, and the numbers will surprise you. Let's start with what it actually costs to open the doors of a medical office before a single patient is ever seen. The average cost to set up a private practice ranges from $100,000 to over $250,000, depending on specialty. Leasehold improvements, turning an empty space into exam rooms, reception, and a procedure room can run $50 to $80 per square foot. For an 1,800 square foot suite, that's roughly $100,000 before a single stethoscope is unboxed. Add permits, architectural drawings, and inspections, and another $10,000 to $15,000 disappears before opening day. Then comes medical equipment. Exam tables, EKG machines, autoclaves for sterilization, and diagnostic tools are essential for any practice. A basic setup for a primary care office typically costs $60,000 to $100,000. Specialists can see that number climb much higher. Every practice has two categories of expense: fixed costs and variable costs. Fixed costs don't change whether you see 5 patients or 50. Rent is the biggest one. A modest office can cost $45,000 to $80,000 a year in rent alone. Add property insurance and utilities, and fixed costs can exceed $10,000 a month before payroll is even factored in. Variable costs rise and fall with patient volume, like medical supplies and lab fees, but these usually make up only 10% of spending. The overwhelming majority of expenses must be paid regardless of patient volume, which makes slow months dangerous for a new practice. Payroll is usually the single largest expense category. A lean staff of 4 typically costs a practice $200,000 a year. This doesn't include the physician's own compensation, which is usually what's left over after every other expense is paid. Malpractice insurance varies wildly. A surgeon can pay over $100,000 annually simply because of the risk profile involved. Revenue in a medical office is not what gets billed. Insurance companies pay a contracted rate, often 60% lower than what's billed. Claims get denied often due to coding errors or missing documentation. Each denial has to be corrected and resubmitted, delaying payment for months. This gap is called the collection rate. A healthy practice collects 70% of billed charges. Anything lower, and the practice is losing money. On average, a private practice spends 60 to 70% of collected revenue on overhead like rent, staff, and equipment loans. Software has become its own growing line item. EHR systems and patient portals can cost small practices $6,000 a month. A primary care physician needs to see 18 to 25 patients a day just to cover overhead before earning personal income. Owning a medical office is running a small business with high fixed costs, delayed revenue, and a payer that decides how much you get paid. Once a medical office survives its first year, a new layer of economics kicks in, one that has less to do with opening costs and more to do with how money actually moves once the practice is running at full speed. The first thing that becomes obvious to any practice owner is that not all patients are worth the same amount to the business. This is called payer mix, and it quietly determines whether a practice thrives or barely survives. A patient with private commercial insurance might generate a reimbursement of $150 for a visit. The same exact visit, for a patient on Medicare, might reimburse at $70 to $90, because Medicare sets fixed rates. Medicaid often pays even less in some states, 40 to 60% of what Medicare pays for the same service. A practice with a payer mix weighted toward Medicaid can see double the volume, yet still bring in less total revenue. This is why location matters. A clinic in a high-income area works with a different financial model than one in a lower-income area. Many practices track their payer mix quarterly, because a shift of 10% can quietly erode profit without any visible change in activity. Then there's the economics of scheduling. Every unfilled appointment slot is lost revenue that can never be recovered. Unlike a retail store, a medical office can't sell yesterday's empty exam room slot today. Average no-show rates sit between 5 and 30%. At 15%, a practice seeing 20 patients only gets paid for 17. Over a year, that gap represents tens of thousands in lost revenue, leading to R-show fees or automated reminder systems. Some practices implement overbooking, borrowing a strategy from the airline industry to offset the predictable percentage who won't show up. Another major factor is the cost of carrying accounts receivable, money earned but not yet paid by insurance. Because reimbursement can take 90 days, a practice needs cash reserves to cover payroll and rent while waiting. Experts recommend keeping 2 to 3 months of expenses in reserve, often $50,000 to $100,000 in idle cash. Practices failing to plan for this gap often rely on lines of credit, where interest becomes a quiet drain on profit. staffing economics also shift. Early on, physicians keep staffing lean, but eventually, adding staff increases profitability. A physician supported by a well-trained assistant can see 25 patients a day instead of 15, outweighing the assistant's cost. This applies to mid-level providers too. They cost a fraction of a physician's salary but generate 70 to 80% of the revenue. Real estate is another decision, lease versus buy. Leasing offers flexibility, but rent builds no equity and rises over time. Buying requires a large upfront investment but builds equity, acting as a separate long-term asset independent of the medical practice. Taxes add another layer. Most practices use S-corporations to reduce self-employment tax compared to being a sole proprietor. Practice owners time equipment purchases toward the end of strong years, using accelerated depreciation to offset high tax bills. Finally, adding a second physician doesn't just double revenue, it spreads fixed costs, improving the overall overhead ratio. Larger practices gain negotiating leverage with insurance companies, securing higher reimbursement rates due to their volume. Running an established medical office is an intricate balancing act between care and complex economic machinery. Beyond the day-to-day cash flow of running a medical office, there's an entire layer of economics tied to how a practice grows its patient base, protects its margins, and eventually determines what the business itself is worth. And this is where the numbers get genuinely surprising. Let's start with patient acquisition. Because in the current healthcare landscape, patients don't just show up the way they used to through word of mouth. Marketing has become a real line item. A functional practice website, search engine optimization, and a basic digital presence typically cost anywhere from $500 to $3,000 a month depending on the market and competition. Practices in competitive specialties like dermatology or dentistry often spend significantly more, sometimes running paid advertising campaigns, where the cost to acquire a single new patient ranges from $50 to over $300, depending on the specialty and local market. This matters because that acquisition cost has to be weighed against lifetime patient value, the total revenue a single patient generates across years. A primary care patient who stays for 10 years might generate $4,000 to $6,000 in collected revenue over that time, which makes even a $200 acquisition cost a reasonable investment. But it also means practices increasingly think like consumer businesses, tracking conversion rates from phone inquiry to booked appointment, something almost no one associated with medicine a generation ago. Ancillary services represent one of the most significant and least understood revenue levers available to an established practice. A standard office visit might generate $90 to $150 in reimbursement, but offering in-house lab draws, basic imaging, or minor procedures changes the math entirely. An in-house lab can add an extra $20 to $40 in reimbursement per relevant visit. At a marginal cost that's often just a few dollars in supplies and the phlebotomist's time. Practices that add services like allergy testing, in-office procedures, or aesthetic treatments such as Botox often see these ancillary lines carry profit margins of 60 to 80%, dramatically higher than the margin on a standard evaluation and management visit. This is precisely why many practices gradually expand into ancillary services, because the core, visit-based model has such thin margins. Supply chain economics matter more than most people expect as well. A solo practice buying gloves, syringes, and diagnostic supplies individually pays retail-adjacent pricing. Once a practice joins a group purchasing organization, supply costs can drop by 10 to 25%. For a practice spending $40,000 a year on supplies, that's a savings of $4,000 to $10,000 annually. Staff turnover is another cost that rarely shows up in a typical financial projection, but significantly affects real-world economics. Replacing a single medical assistant typically costs a practice somewhere between $3,000 and $5,000. Replacing a nurse or a billing specialist, given the specialized knowledge required, can reach $8,000 to $10,000 per departure. High turnover practices can quietly lose tens of thousands of dollars a year simply cycling through staff. Money that never appears on a profit and loss statement as turnover cost but drains the practice all the same. Technology decisions continue to carry real financial weight. Telehealth, for instance, became a significant part of practice economics. A telehealth visit typically costs a practice almost nothing beyond the physician's time, no exam room turnover or in-person staff needed. This makes telehealth one of the highest margin services many practices offer today, particularly for medication management. Compliance and regulatory costs also deserve mention, because they're both mandatory and often underestimated. A mid-sized practice might spend $3,000 to $8,000 a year specifically on compliance-related software and training. A single HIPAA data breach can result in fines ranging from thousands to well over $100,000. Eventually, many practice owners face the question of what the practice itself is actually worth, particularly as they approach retirement. Medical practices are typically valued using a multiple of EBITDA earnings before interest, taxes, depreciation, and amortization, depending on specialty and location. Private practices often sell for somewhere between 3 and 6 times annual EBITDA. A practice generating $300,000 in EBITDA might be valued between $900,000 and $1.8 million. This has fueled a trend: private equity firms actively acquiring independent practices, particularly in dermatology and dental care. They consolidate back-office functions like billing and purchasing across multiple practices to improve overhead ratio at scale. Independent practices increasingly compete with well-capitalized groups that can outspend smaller practices on marketing. This calculation comes down to a trade-off between control and income stability versus the scale advantages of joining a larger structure. The economics of a maturing medical practice extend well beyond simply seeing patients and collecting reimbursement. It is a sophisticated business requiring attention to acquisition, supply chain, and eventual valuation. This is the final piece of the puzzle, the part of medical office economics that determines whether a practice survives long-term, and it has almost nothing to do with medicine itself. Let's start with insurance contract negotiation, something most solo physicians never learn to do effectively. Every time a practice signs a contract with an insurance company, the reimbursement rates in that contract are locked in, often for 1 to 3 years. Most new practice owners simply accept whatever rate is offered because they don't know negotiation is even possible. But practices that track their own data, visit volume, patient outcomes, average reimbursement per pair, and bring that data to renewal negotiations, can often secure rate increases of 3 to 8% on a practice collecting $400,000 a year. Even a 5% increase across major payers translates to $20,000 in additional annual revenue without seeing a single additional patient. This is why larger practices hire dedicated contract negotiators or consultants, since the return on that investment is often 10 to 20 times the fee. Diversifying payer contracts also matters more than most physicians realize early on. A practice reliant on just 2 or 3 insurance companies for the bulk of its revenue is financially fragile. If one payer cuts reimbursement rates or drops the practice from its network, the impact can be severe. Practices that build a broader payer mix tend to weather rate changes and payer disputes far better than those concentrated in just 1 or 2 contracts. Debt management is another area that quietly shapes long-term practice economics. Most practices carry some combination of a startup loan, equipment financing, and possibly a real estate mortgage. The interest rates on these loans vary significantly. SBA loans for medical practices typically run in the 7 to 10% range. A practice that refinances high-interest equipment debt into a lower-rate SBA loan can sometimes cut thousands of dollars a year in interest payments. Retirement and benefits planning represents a piece of practice economics that's easy to defer but expensive to ignore. Because private practice physicians don't have an employer contributing to a 401k retirement, savings has to be built into the practice's financial structure. Many owners set up a solo 401k or a defined benefit plan, which can allow contributions over $60,000 a year. Structured correctly, this simultaneously reduces taxable income and builds long-term wealth. But it requires intentional financial planning. Succession planning is another long-horizon economic factor that shapes decisions physicians make years before they ever plan to retire. A practice with no clear succession plan often loses significant value if the founding physician becomes unable to work suddenly. Practices that bring on a junior partner years in advance tend to preserve far more of their value at transition. This is part of why practice valuation isn't just a number calculated at the moment of sale. It's something actively built over years. Finally, there's a broader economic force reshaping the entire landscape: value-based care. Traditionally, physicians get paid for volume, more visits, more procedures, more bill codes, more revenue. But models are shifting toward value-based models, where practices are paid partly based on patient outcomes and preventive care metrics. This rewards a different kind of investment: care coordinators, outreach programs, and chronic disease management systems. Practices that adapt early are finding new revenue streams, while practices that ignore it risk seeing their reimbursement rates squeezed over time. Owning a medical office isn't simply the financial reward at the end of education. It's an entirely separate discipline. The doctors who thrive financially aren't necessarily the best clinicians. They're the ones who learn to treat their practice as seriously as their patients.